Well, welcome everyone over to the Charter for Compassion and the Charter Education Institute. We are hosting a webinar today with Dr. Monica Worline, and I have to say I'm very excited about this. We've had conversation off to the side, and they've been wonderful conversations. And Monica, you just have this warm personality that I know everybody's going to really resonate with as we move forward. Just a couple of things around today. Please stay with us. We're going to do a Q&A as we kind of move along, and as at the end of the webinar as well, just to kind of bring together all of the different thoughts that have happened with us. Monica is coming with us from California today. She travels a lot, but today she's actually at her home base, which is wonderful. And I've got to say, I read your book. And this is a book that is full of candor and wisdom and really practical ideas. It's full of a tremendous amount of, which is important to me, and that's inspiration that makes people take a call to action. And it's important also to understand that this is all surrounded around 2 decades of research on the topic of kindness at work. And I don't think that we can have enough of that conversation that we bring to the table. It's what I noticed about the work that you're doing, and that's really what we're here to talk about today, is your book that's co-authored with Dr. Jane Dutton, and it is called Awakening Compassion at Work. And again, a topic that is so crucial, and I think really crucial because right now we are in a high-tech world, and what your book brings to the table is the high-touch part of that, which is a message that we all really need to hear. Just so you know a little bit more about Monica before I hand it over, she's the CEO and founder of EnlivenWork, which is your own consulting practice, I'm assuming. She also teaches, is a research scientist at Stanford CCARE, which is the Compassion, Altruism Research and Education Center, and is the executive director of Compassion Lab, which has been around for many years and has been definitely part of the work that I've been looking at around workplaces and compassion. And it is the world-leading research collaboratory, and it focuses on compassion work and brings together all different types of work from around the globe. Monica holds a leadership or lectureship at the Ross School of Business, University of Michigan, and is affiliate faculty at the Center for Positive Organizations, which is a brilliant name to start with. And I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit about those potentially as we move along as well. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Monica, to get us going, and then I'll come back at the end to wrap us up.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you to the Charter for Compassion. Thank you for the existence of the Charter for Compassion, I want to say to the world. I'm so glad the Charter exists, and I'm glad to be a supporter of it in as many ways as I possibly can. And I'm really honored to share some of our work related to compassion and work organizations today. So I'm going to switch over and share my screen for a little while. I have some slides that are mostly here just for visual aids, but I think they will help people follow along on the kinds of things that I want to talk about today. So, as Olivia said, I am an affiliate faculty at the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan. And that is a research center and a teaching center and a center for practice that's actually dedicated to how to create and sustain organizations that are both high performing in their impact and highly humanly sustainable in the way that they accomplish what they try to do. And I have worked for 20 years with my co-author on this book, Jane Dutton, who Jane is also one of the co-founders of Compassion Lab. And Compassion Lab, I want to give a shout out to any of my Compassion Lab colleagues who might be watching. Compassion Lab is a distinctive space within the world of compassion research because we are a group that's dedicated specifically to compassion in organizations and organization contexts. So I know there's a lot of compassion research going on all around the world nowadays, which is so exciting. When we started Compassion Lab, we published the first paper that we could find in the organizational behavior literature. And people at that time didn't really think of compassion as a viable research topic for business, organizations, organizational psychology, and so on. So we have been carrying the torch for that time, but also been witness to the tremendous growth of interest in this topic. And that's part of what led us to write Awakening Compassion at Work. And as you said, Olivia, it is 20 years of compassion and workplace research, but written in a way that we hope is very practical, very accessible, illustrated with a lot of examples and stories, and also very useful and pragmatic. So that brings me to the flow of the webinar for today. I want to tell you just a little bit more about myself and about Jane and why we ended up writing this book in the big picture, in the big scheme of things. And that will lead me deeper into the content. So I'll share a definition of compassion as a social process that guides us as researchers, but I think it's actually very helpful to see this definition if you want to be a change agent in your organization or in your own work group or team. This definition actually helps you see some new possibilities about how you could do things differently to create more compassion at work. I then want to share a way of making the case for compassion in work organizations. I assume that with an audience at the Charter for Compassion, I don't actually have to convince you that compassion matters. But what I do know from a long time of doing this work is that we all, as dedicated change agents for compassion, have to be conversant in how to make a case for what we do to other people, whether they are decision makers or people in the media, leaders, people who control resources that we'd like to tap into of some kind. Having different ways of making the case about why compassion matters is so useful as a change agent. So I'll share the way that we make the case in a couple of different ways to be helpful in that kind of a sense. And then the bulk of the time, and I hope the bulk of the questions also, I will explore what we call the social architecture of compassion. This is really ways of thinking about compassion at the organization and system level, a little bit different from the interpersonal way of thinking about compassion, although definitely building on it. And this is really, I think, the distinctive space of the Compassion Lab research and organizational researchers is to help all of us think about what happens in the system beyond our interpersonal interactions that can make compassion easier or harder. And this is really quite an important question to me because it's partly related to my personal experience, and it's partly related to what I know as an organizational psychologist about people's working lives. So this 100,000 that's showing on the screen right now is a way of reminding me and reminding you that most of us will spend 100,000 hours of our lives at work. It's not an insignificant investment. It's not an insignificant amount of time. And over the course of those 100,000 hours, of course, beautiful things will happen. We'll have victories. We will do things that make us feel proud. We'll accomplish things that we really feel leave a lasting legacy in the world. And over the course of those 100,000 hours, we will do things that we're not so proud of. We will make errors and mistakes that we have to fix, or maybe that we regret. We'll have difficult interactions with colleagues or supervisors. We will have losses in our personal lives, inevitably, as will the people around us. And so part of the reason that we feel so passionately about this book is that we have, all of us working in this project have our own life losses and our own life victories that we have a lived practice of sharing with each other in the Compassion Lab. And so I want to just share as a way for you to know me a bit more fully as a human being. This is my dog, Amaya. A picture of my dog, Amaya. And this picture was taken just a couple of days before she died last year. And I love having her picture with me when I talk about compassion, because I do think that oftentimes we interpersonally can learn and practice compassion with animals and nature and other beings in ways that that are different than how we can do it with other people. And sometimes we need that renewal in our spirits and in our energy in order to keep going with the difficult work of trying to awaken compassion in the tough spaces in our lives. But also I put this picture of Amaya here in the context of work to remind me that compassion always unfolds in the context of pain or suffering, and that there are so many different kinds of pain and suffering that all of us experience in our working lives, and how the organization around us responds to those forms of pain and suffering make a very big difference in how quickly we can recover, how much we heal, and how much we are able to rejoin and give our energy and our work back to our work environment. So in the case of the loss of a pet, for instance, we have had instances in our research over the years where we've had people talk about how when they lost their pets, their work organization responded by really embracing this as an important loss in their lives and doing something coordinated to recognize the loss and to memorialize this relationship in some kind of way. And that seemed deeply compassionate for coworkers and work organizations to recognize that kind of a loss. And we also heard stories and seen examples where it wasn't actually recognized at all as an important moment of loss in people's lives, and where this relationship disappeared and it was never mentioned or never acknowledged in work organizations. And so I know there are all kinds of suffering and loss in work, and this is just one simple kind of example, but to me, it's a very vivid example of how in one organization, a loss treated in one way can replenish me and renew me and rededicate me to my work and to my colleagues. And in another organization where I might love and cherish those people and they are just as kind, the work environment isn't set up to acknowledge losses and to bring them, bring the resources like aid and comfort and support. And in that organization, when people suffer losses and the losses aren't addressed, there is a significant undermining of their human capacity for some amount of time. And sometimes there's a significant undermining of their commitment to the collective endeavor that may lead to a significant loss of human potential. So if you just think about that kind of a simple story about two different organizations treating the loss of a pet differently, just imagine and extrapolate from there the differences in how workplaces treat workplace accidents or workplace violence. Think about how they treat incidences of workplace discrimination or harassment. Think about how they treat instances of downsizing or other kinds of suffering that are actually created in the course of doing business. And also the differential in how they treat celebrating the great things that happen in people's lives, and sharing the wealth of work and the meaning of work with everyone who works in the organization. Part of the deep motivation for Jane and I to write the book on awakening compassion at work is that we see over and over again an insistence on perpetuating a myth of business as a non-human endeavor, or work as something that's other than human and emotional. And in fact, when we just simply share a story like my story of losing my dog, we can really quickly tap into the fact that work and the people in workplaces are experiencing all kinds of human joy, human suffering, and the entire range of what makes us human. So that's one motivation. Another motivation is that each of us, Jane and I, have stories, episodes of pretty significant suffering in our lives where we felt that our work organizations responded sometimes in ways that were helpful and sometimes in ways that were harmful. But when we look across the survey literature, what is true over and over and over again is that 50% of people in many different kinds of populations tell survey researchers that if something really terrible happened in their lives, they wouldn't have a significant person to go to for help or for aid. So when we think about the ways that our work organizations and the people in our lives have responded to suffering, we're already a step ahead from half of the population who experiences suffering and doesn't feel that they have anywhere to turn. And when we think of those kinds of statistics and we look simultaneously at the levels of burnout that are astronomically rising across all kinds of professional categories, we look at rising rates of suicide across all different kinds of professions, and we look at the rate of incivility at work that people report. Over 90% of people say they regularly experience some form of incivility in their work environment. We see that this is an epidemic of human suffering, and that it can't be the case that work organizations don't have a role in addressing and tending to this widespread human suffering. So that's another deep motivation for us to go out of the research lab and try to talk about compassion at work in a way that helps all of the people who we know are out there, like you on this webinar with us, to use whatever little things that we have learned over the years to become more effective change agents, and to become a part of the movement that we absolutely must have for business and work to become a part of the compassionate solution to the epidemics of suffering that we're facing as a globe. So when I say suffering and compassion, I think it's helpful for me to be clear as a researcher about what I mean. But remember, I'm also hoping that this definition is useful to you as a, oops, excuse me, I hit the wrong button, as a change agent. So the typical definition of compassion in psychology, for instance, is the one that's written across the top of the screen here. Sensitivity to the pain or suffering of another, coupled with a deep desire to alleviate that suffering. And that is a starting point for us as organizational researchers. But when we want to take that definition and look at it and really track how it works in people's working lives, we have to add something to it. So we use a process model that includes action and goes beyond compassion as emotion. And so I like to think of this as a 4-part human experience that always unfolds in relation to pain or suffering. So if you start with some form of pain or suffering entering the workplace, it will be expressed in some kind of way. Sometimes it will be very small, and in fact, it won't be noticed or picked up on at all. At other times, it may be much more visible or easily expressed, and people will easily notice it. So the first step of this 4-part sort of process model is attention or noticing of suffering. And that goes hand in hand with the fact that as human beings, we're meaning-making people, and we're interpreting everything around us all the time. So we have to not only notice suffering in our work environments, but we have to interpret that suffering as if it is worthy of our attention and as if the people who are suffering deserve a compassionate response. And many aspects of work organizations can actually make that kind of interpretation much harder. So one way that work organizations inhibit compassion is by shaping our interpretation of what's relevant and what we should give our time and energy to, and who is actually worthy of our empathy and our compassion. The third part of the process is, once I've noticed some suffering in my work environment, I interpret it as relevant to me and that I want to respond, and the person or people are worthy of my response. That moves me to an emotional state that researchers call empathic concern. This is probably a very educated audience on the empathy and compassion relationship, but we talk about empathic concern as a particular form of empathy that may not involve feeling exactly what the other person feels, but it does involve feeling concern for the other people's well-being and wanting them to be well. And what we know about the feeling of empathic concern as the third part of this model is that it will take us really quickly and automatically into the 4th step of the model, which is that we will want to act. We will want to do something to help support the other person's well-being or alleviate their suffering when we feel empathic concern. So let me just very quickly say the 4 parts of the human experience here that you can also see on the screen: noticing, interpreting, feeling, and acting. And then if you look at the arrows in the process model, one reason I think this is really helpful as a process model is that where each of the arrows link to each other in the model, there's research that people are doing now or have done in the past to show that the process can actually easily break down in the linkages between these points. So a lot of suffering in organizations never gets tended to simply because it isn't noticed. The link between expressing pain and noticing pain can be a really difficult one if the work organization is really busy, if people feel overloaded, if there's a lot of information coming their way and they have many things to pay attention to. It can be hard to pay attention to the human state of other people around us. We can be encouraged by our organizations to not give attention to pain in the case of something like downsizings, where we're sort of told to ignore what's happening and feel lucky that you're not one of the people on the RIF list and go back to work. And we may never see those people who were our colleagues again. And so being able to respond to their suffering becomes much more difficult when the link between expressing and noticing breaks, of course, then none of the rest of the process can unfold. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and look at the Q&A panel. And as I do that, I want to invite any of you that might have questions about this process model or this kind of definition of compassion in workplaces to go ahead and pose a question in the Q&A panel. And Olivia is going to pay close attention to that. And I also want to be as interactive as I can. So if you have a question, please post it there for us. Okay, so Veronica in the Q&A panel is asking something about relationship between an independent professional and a client. It's harder to recognize and respond to suffering because of the nature of an independent relationship between a professional and a client. And I think that's a really great question and example for us to use as we think about this model and why it's helpful. Because I do think that if you're in a client and professional provider kind of relationship, it can be difficult to notice pain in that relationship because you may not have a lot of interactions, or the interactions that you do have may be very task-focused interactions where there isn't a lot of in-between time for people to talk to each other or talk about things outside of work. I think also there's an interpretive difficulty in a client and professional relationship about knowing, interpreting when it is appropriate to raise and to inquire, even if you notice that something might be wrong or that someone might be suffering in that relationship. It can be difficult to know when it's appropriate to do the kind of inquiry work that helps people interpret the suffering and interpret the kinds of actions that might be useful. And that brings me to the link between interpreting and acting that I'll just touch on a little bit here too. That if we only know people in the context of being a client or being a service provider, and we don't know them more broadly or more generally, or we can't, within the bounds of that relationship, figure out how to ask the kinds of questions that would help us make sense of the suffering, then it can be really difficult, even if we feel deeply concerned about our client, to know exactly what kind of action would alleviate the suffering. So the link between interpreting and acting can become a difficult one, depending on the kinds of professional relationships that we're embedded in. And that, I think, Veronica, is a perfect example of how taking compassion as a human experience and then taking account of how it's embedded in a whole set of work relationships, work norms, and the work environment can make what's already a complex human experience even more difficult or more likely to fail because of these sensitive points in the process. So let me switch gears here a little bit and let me invite you to think of an example. And if we were all together in a room right now, I'd ask you to share the stories with each other. But if you think of an example from your own experience of a time when you were suffering or someone else was suffering at work, it's useful to think about that example in relation to what happened in terms of other people in the work environment or the organization level itself, and what didn't happen, I think, is sometimes even more informative than what did happen. So what kinds of actions did people take or not take? And what difference did it make? The kinds of actions that people did or didn't take, why did they matter? So these are pretty simple questions in relation to a story, but in our experience of teaching and talking about compassion, actually starting with this kind of a story of compassion, it doesn't even have to be that I was the main character in the story. It can be something I witnessed in my work environment. Just unpacking one example like this with other people in my work environment can evoke all kinds of lessons about compassion and the workplace and help people grapple with the dilemmas that come up when we take a topic like compassion and we situate it in a work environment. So I wanted to share with you from our research some of the most common kinds of pain or suffering that people name when we've asked them to tell these kinds of stories, and then we've coded many compassion stories over the years. The kinds of pain that are prevalent in these stories have to do with two general categories, I would say. One is the kinds of pain that tend to come with us through the door of work. So loss in our personal lives, financial strain, a death in our family, the loss of a significant relationship, the illness in the family, illness of oneself, and stress and anxiety about what's going on in the broader life outside of work. And another bucket of kinds of pain and suffering that people commonly name and describe when they tell stories of compassion at work have to do with the ways that the work itself and the organization can create suffering. So organizational change is often a place where people experience significant pain in their work. Of course, downsizing, as I mentioned, can be a source of pain, both for the people who are leaving an organization and also for those who remain. Corrosive politics in an organization, people feeling undermined, feeling not treated with respect, and being blamed for errors and mistakes that can have a long-lasting effect on people when errors and mistakes aren't treated as sources for compassionate learning. The other thing that we learn from stories of compassion at work and from coding and trying to understand a lot of them is that there are forms of compassionate action that are really prevalent, and they happen in almost all organizations, whether people would rate the overall organization as highly compassionate or not. We find pockets of these kinds of actions in almost every organization, and also pockets where they're notably absent. But the actions themselves can range from what seem like quite quote-unquote small, or what we call micro moves of compassion toward colleagues and coworkers and supervisors, or they can become quite elaborate and coordinated across whole units, whole organizations, sometimes even across global systems. So the actions that are most common are really being present with another person. And so much of our interpersonal learning has to do with how to stay present with other people who are suffering. Listening and asking questions that help people come to grips with their own situation, and flexibility to use time in different kinds of ways. The number one request that employees tend to have of work organizations in the wake of suffering is actually flexibility. It's not even necessarily to have time off or away, but it is to have more flexibility in the use of time or the doing of tasks. And then we can see other kinds of things that we would call resources that aren't just time and money, although time and money do help in some cases, but social support, helping, very instrumental helping, rallying around someone, driving them places, providing childcare, making meals and delivering meals. There are common kinds of social support that get organized in workplaces. There's also consistent emotional support, like the writing of cards, the expression of concern, the leaving of small notes, the saying a kind word, or acknowledging that a loss is ongoing over time. And those kinds of resources are often coupled with money raising, donations of vacation time, and other kinds of material support. And in the instances when the compassion is most competent, what we call competent, meaning that it's organized well across an entire system, those kinds of resources, material resources, emotional resources, social resources, interpersonal resources, are all customized to the form of suffering that's there. So they get coordinated across people and across units, but they also get deeply customized to what's actually going to be useful. And I'm moving toward making the case here, right? So if you know the common forms of suffering in workplaces, and we know a lot about the common forms of compassion that are easily available in our workplaces that we can unlock to meet that suffering, then when we try to measure what happens and why does it matter, of course, for the person who's suffering, there's some strong impacts. Feeling less anxiety and a greater ability to cope with what's happening. A sense of being valued at work is often accompanied by a very strong commitment to the people and the work organization. So people whose suffering at work is greeted with compassion tend to recover faster and come back to work as a more renewed, more committed contributor. There are lots of effects for the people who actually participate in a compassion process as well. They come to think of themselves as being able to be more compassionate people at work, so their identity actually changes in the work environment. There's a stronger sense of satisfaction with the giving of compassion, and that often translates into a stronger sense of meaningful relationships and meaningful work, a sense of more positive emotions of all kinds in the work environment, and a really strong, renewed, and strengthened sense of being more connected to our coworkers. And then finally, something that we can easily overlook, but that is really important for those of us who want to make the case about why instances of compassion should be elevated and celebrated in our work organizations, is that when compassion happens at work, even those who witness it, if they didn't participate in the process at all, but they saw it unfold around them, feel an increased sense of pride and other kinds of positive emotions at work. They get more motivated to participate in a compassion process sometime in the future, and they're much more likely to think that their organization is actually a compassionate place to work. And that, at the interpersonal level, that kind of dynamic feeds into what's happening at the system level when more people are having more of those experiences that we just described. Right? When there's more compassion taking place in a work environment and people see other people treating each other with more compassion, then what Jane and I have done is do a big, broad survey of all the literature we could find, not just our own work, but any work across disciplines that related to the impacts of compassion on something organizational, or something that we might call a strategic advantage that organizations are interested in building. And there are 5 with very, very strong evidence to back them up. And so if this is part of what you do as a change agent, is making the case for compassion, one way of making it is something like this, that when people feel that they work in a more compassionate environment, they feel more psychologically safe. They're more likely to learn from errors. They're more likely to be adaptable to change. And they're more likely to want to participate in innovation processes where they're creating new value for the organization. When people feel that their organization is more compassionate, they're actually more able to respond to the pain that's around them, including the pain of customers and clients. So back to Veronica's sense of it might be hard sometimes to respond to the pain in the client-provider relationship, but when in your own work environment, right, one provider to another, you're being more compassionate with each other, you're enabling that process of service quality or care quality with your clients and customers. We know that teamwork and collaboration changes when people feel that they work in compassionate work environments. This is partly because people build trust with each other. They see their relationships as higher quality. They're more likely to cooperate with each other, and they're more likely to engage in solution-oriented information sharing and other kinds of things that makes collaboration more successful. There's a lot of evidence from all kinds of disciplines now that feeling you live and work in a more compassionate organization increases people's engagement, meaning they're going to bring more discretionary effort to the work, and also this lessens empathy fatigue and has a significant effect on burnout. And I was just the last 2 days in Boston at the Schwartz Center Compassion in Action in Healthcare conference, and it was very impressive to see a wide variety of healthcare organizations from all around the United States presenting data about increasing levels of burnout in their nurse and physician populations and other care provider populations, but also an amazing array of compassion initiatives that are helping to combat this burnout, turn it around, and actually increase engagement and build more positive capability in the system. And then finally, the fifth point is about being able to keep talented people. So most organizations compete on talent in some way, shape, or form. And if you can attract and retain more talented people, that can be a deep source of competitive advantage. So here's another glance at the same kind of evidence. This is not one study that I'm showing you here, but across multiple studies. This graph is meant to be suggestive and show you that evidence exists in the research literature for when an organization encounters a downturn, of some kind, that if people feel that that's a more compassionate work environment, they're going to recover their profitability more quickly. So compassion relates to more resilient profitability in firm level data, more and greater care quality or service quality, keeping talented people, building deeper and different kinds of work relationships, cultivating more engaged and highly contributing employees, and more learning and growth and adaptability to change. So why don't I stop there for another minute before I want to go on, and with the next 15 minutes or so, I want to talk about the social architecture of compassion, which is how we build on the interpersonal process of compassion to actually talk about building the system around skilled, compassionate people so that the system itself becomes more competent. But before I do that, if you have any questions about the case for compassion or compassion and strategic advantage in organizations, go ahead and enter them.
Hi, Monica, it's Olivia.
Yes.
Susan has asked a really interesting question, and she works in organ donation network and with organ donation families. And she says donor families oftentimes have a very difficult time assimilating back into work. How does compassion become a corporate mandate for companies with a structure instead of relying on individual kindness and awareness?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Susan, for the work that you're doing, and also for a great question. It's actually a perfect segue question into talking about social architecture. So why don't I just do that, Olivia, and then
Sure.
we can, hopefully this will start the answer to that question. And then Susan, if you have more specific questions based on it, please share them. So this is exactly what Jane and I wanted to address with the majority of our book, which is how do we go, what does organizational scholarship tell us about how we might go from the individual kindness and awareness to building a system that's competent of being compassionate over and over again to different kinds of suffering and to different people wherever they happen to be located in a broader system. And the framework that we have for talking about how organizations become competent at a system level is a 4-dimension look at an organization. So the way of thinking about this is that there are 4 aspects of organizations. There are 4 ways of actually thinking about what an organization is and how it does what it does. And each of these 4 ways of thinking about your organization can give you ideas about making compassion more systemic and built in rather than something that is accidental and happens just depending on the whether or not people happen to notice what's going on in one another's lives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these dimensions separately, but the 4 are I'm going to refer to as culture or values, networks, and I'll define what I mean by networks. I mean human social networks, roles, by which I mean zones of responsibility that are designated in an organization, and routines, which are defined as the way that people accomplish interdependent tasks. And what I think is happening most in the world right now when I go out and talk with people about compassion is that a lot of people are starting to think about culture, and they're starting to talk about building compassionate cultures, which is great and important, and I'm all for it. I don't want to dampen anyone's enthusiasm about compassionate culture, but we know that culture, the way organizational scholars define culture, is that it rests deeply on the values that people hold about what's good, that are shaped by the organization, and the fundamental beliefs that we have about human nature in that organization. And because culture is so grounded in values and beliefs about human nature and human beings, it can be quite difficult and slow to change. So we actually think that having other vantage points on the social architecture of compassion is quite useful for people that want to make organizational change happen and want to make it more systemic for those people like the donor recipients who are trying to reintegrate into an organization. So if you think about this as architecture, that metaphor is actually really useful because it is like the way the building is going to shape the way that we walk around inside of it. We think of these social architectures become relatively invisible to us, but they actually are operating in the background all the time, shaping what people do at work and what they take for granted at work and what they think is appropriate at work. And so I'm going to start by talking about networks, and then I'm going to go through each of the 4 aspects. And if you want to think about your story of compassion that I invited you to call to mind earlier, one way to make this more clear for yourself is to try to think about these in relation to one example. So, for instance, with networks, networks, the way sociologists think of networks, is they're the social structures that tie people together. They are the repeated interactions that we have where we share information, we share advice, and we also share energy and emotion through these ties. So there are formal networks in organizations that are mapped by an organizational chart, for instance. There are also informal networks of information sharing and advice sharing and energy that flow through a system. And when you want to think about making compassion more systemic, one thing you want to think about is how are the networks tying people together in ways that make compassion more likely. So I want to give you a couple of examples of this because it sounds abstract, but if we just think about our own compassion community, right now there is, as I said, an epidemic level of burnout in healthcare providers around the world. And there are many, many, many people who have started to pay a lot of attention about what is going to happen to our system if we don't address that in some way. And so all kinds of energy is going into trying to combat burnout in healthcare. And when I was at this conference that I mentioned for the past 2 days, it was the first time that the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare had ever held an in-person conference. And so all of a sudden there were 300 people together in the same room sharing information about what they're doing in their organization to try to combat burnout. And they were learning that an organization just down the road was doing something really similar, and they had something to learn from each other. They were also learning about people hundreds or thousands of miles away that had really similar ideas or that had different ideas, and they were able to share and learn from them. So within any system, if you can tie people together in different kinds of ways that are relevant and help them learn from each other, that's an opportunity for awakening compassion. So in relation to Susan's question, you might think of A, how do you get donor recipients to know each other better and share stories about what makes integration easier for them? And how do you find and tap into and bring together the people who want to be supporters and champions? And how do you get them talking to each other about what advocacy is possible so that you're building a network of people that are actually invested in integration and invested in success and capable of learning and inventing new ways of making the system respond more capably? Another example of networks that awaken compassion comes from an organization that was very geographically dispersed. There had operations spread across 5 different states, and they wanted a way to tap into what was actually happening across all of these different locations to see where there was compassion and where they had opportunities to leverage and build on great things that were already going on within the organization, just that the leadership didn't know about it. So they created an award for compassionate contributors. And when they gave this award, along with the recognition of the award, came an invitation and funding to come to a compassionate award winner summit. And they invited all of these Compassion Award winners to come together for one day and to share what they were doing in their local environments, to meet each other, to form relationships with each other. They had different kinds of activities for them to do to share information. And they also brought the leadership teams from different sites and from the corporate headquarters to this event to hear stories about what was going on and to meet this group of basically activists and champions and to form some kind of a group identity among them. So instead of each of these compassionate contributors being isolated in their different settings, they could suddenly know each other, start to form ties and relationships, share information and strategies and tactics, start to think of themselves as a group. They loved being a group. The leadership loved meeting them. The stories were so powerful that they decided they would do this every year, and they would bring the original winners back plus new winners every year. So you can imagine that over just a few years, you're going to actually build a really big network of people who think of themselves as invested in compassion in the organization and who are sharing lots of new ideas about how to do it more structurally. The next way that you might think about building on the networks in the organization is then by thinking about, well, how can we get those networks also to value or recognize compassion as a part of what they do. And I think one of the most interesting ways that people can think about values becoming lived values and not just lip service is by actually taking what some organizations call mini field trips, right? So in one organization in Canada that was really working on creating more compassion in their change process, the leaders asked the change management professionals to describe the process that they'd used in the past. And the change managers said, really, it's a bunch of human remains strewn in the ditches. And that was the way they described their change process and the effects of it. And that description was so powerful in its absence of compassion for people going through change and for those trying to lead change, that they decided that they would not embark on any more change decisions without sending a cross-functional group of people to a local site and having them actually attempt to do the work change that they were suggesting, and come back and report to the broader leadership and the broader change team about whether or not it was actually a good idea and it was actually a feasible change in the work environment. And by taking that value of compassion and not just keeping it in the conference room, but actually sending people out and having them try to live out the value as a part of the daily work, they saw a whole different array of change possibilities and really changed their decision making quite substantially around compassion. So making your values lived in a very concrete, tangible way is another way that compassion goes from lip service or kindness between people to something that's more systemic and built into the organizational process. The third aspect of the social architecture is roles. By roles, we mean the way people define what they're responsible for. So in my role as a professor, I can think I'm responsible for delivering a certain set of content. I can think I'm responsible for tracking the attendance of students over time, or I can think I'm responsible for helping them learn, or I can think I'm responsible for helping them become the kind of person that they're ultimately going to be in the world. And how I define my zone of responsibility and how the organization influences me to define that responsibility has a huge effect on whether or not I think compassion is relevant to my work. And this is one of the ways that organizations can awaken a huge amount of compassion, because any type of work can be reimagined with more compassion in it. So any kind of work in the organizations that you're working with, Susan, for organ donors and organ recipient integration could be reimagined as helping in that integration and helping sort of create compassion for those who are reintegrating into the system. And I'm sure you all know lots of stories of this, but I'll just share a couple of examples that to me are powerful because they're not the kind of job roles that you would instantaneously say, oh yeah, definitely compassionate. But I never think in terms of compassion and a role anymore. I just think of how can the role be infused with compassion. So at this healthcare conference I was at, I heard a great example of a cashier in the hospital cafeteria who had a patient's wife coming through the line multiple times on multiple days and just buying a 5-cent cup of water. And after multiple times of this, the cashier said, "Don't you want some food?" And the woman said, "Oh, well, my husband was in a terrible accident and we don't actually live here. And I don't have anything with me and I don't have a way to have any money." And the cashier said, "It doesn't matter. You always come through my line and I will make sure that we take care of it." So by being attuned and noticing the potential for suffering, by being able to ask a question that elicited more information and allowed more interpretation of that suffering, right there in the cashier line, the cashier was able to take an improvised action. And partly that was enabled by the whole system saying to everyone, part of your job is to take care of the people that you come into contact with. Another example of this that I absolutely love is a city government that was working to try to increase compassion in their transit system. They brought all of their bus drivers together and they had some focus groups around what would make your job more aligned with our compassion initiative. And the bus drivers talked about what that meant and made sense of that for a while. And they said, you know, well, actually driving the bus is only a task, but the job is actually much bigger than that. If we really wanted to do our work with compassion, we would be stewards of refuge for people as they travel through the city. And if our bus is a place of refuge, then we would get to know the people who come regularly. We would help direct them toward resources that might be useful to them if they're riding the bus just to get warm because they don't have a place to go. We would want to know more about conflict resolution so that we could intervene more effectively if there was some incident on the bus. Right? There were all kinds of ways that the work of a bus driver, when imagined with compassion, became a different kind of work. And there were hundreds of ideas for awakening compassion across the transit system that emerged out of that kind of a conversation about how to define the role differently. And this is the fourth part of social architecture, and I am going to, again, go back to the Q&A panel after I talk about this. But this is one of my favorite things to talk about people with when they're really interested in awakening compassion, because I think there's so much latent potential that we aren't using in an organization's routines. Now, what I mean by a routine, organizational scholars define routines as the recurrent ways of accomplishing interdependent work. So they happen over and over again, and multiple people participate in them in order to get some collective task done. And that, by definition, means that if you can infuse this thing with more compassion, it's going to likely scale because the routine involves multiple people and it has to be done over and over again. And so the other thing about routines that organizational scholarship shows us is that they're stable in the sense that they recur repeatedly in order to accomplish tasks, but they're also flexible in that people can improvise within the routine to take different kinds of action and still incorporate it in the overall routine. So routines are a space where you can really think about systematizing compassion differently. There are common kinds of routines that happen in every organization. So recruiting people, finding members, if you're a membership organization, how do you do that in ways that awaken more compassion, or that convey compassion, or that invite people to relate with your organization more compassionately? Interviewing and hiring is a space where it really matters how you do that if you want to awaken compassion in your system, because it's the first impression and the lasting trajectory that someone will take about how to be a member of your organization, depending on how they're brought in. So that principle in organizations that first moments matter means that these interviewing and hiring routines are really important spaces to think about whether you're awakening compassion with as much potential as you possibly could. How you train people and onboard people and get them up to speed can be done with more and less compassion. How you say goodbye to people who are leaving, whether they're leaving voluntarily or whether they're leaving as a consequence of a performance issue, or whether they're leaving as a consequence of the organization needing to let them go for monetary reasons. Saying goodbye is such a missed opportunity for compassion when we don't do it well in our organizations, and it creates a lot of suffering for people. I worked with a project manager recently who had been going through a merger, and as part of the merger, some people were let go, and other people were just moved around the globe into new positions, and they were moved really quickly. And this project manager was sitting with her team in Bulgaria, getting them started on their new project and doing some team activities with them. And the team was just lethargic and not really excited to take up this new project, which otherwise should have been very exciting for them. And so the project manager had the presence of mind to ask, what's going on? Help me understand what's happening here. And the team told her that many of the people who had been reassigned were not just coworkers, but they were family friends. Because of the way their work in their society was structured, they tended to take their vacations together. Their kids were often in daycare together, or their families exchanged childcare activities through the week. And they felt like, in addition to losing their colleagues and having to adapt to this whole new work environment, they'd also lost their friendship networks and their childcare. And one of the engineers actually described it to the project manager. He said, we're going through a work divorce, and we're really sad. And so I think that it came to light then in exploring how that change process and that merger was managed, that people weren't given a chance to say goodbye to their colleagues. They weren't given time to adapt to this change. And there wasn't a recognition that these relationships matter so much to people. So they didn't really have even the opportunity for a celebratory time with their friends before they had to leave each other. And that created a lot of pain in the organization. That was totally unnecessary pain to create, that just came without thinking creatively about the merger routine and the offboarding routine. So one final example of a routine, because I think it's a really interesting one that we're doing research on right now, is in the manufacturing environment and the healthcare environment. The shift change is a place where people have a lot of interpersonal struggles with each other. The off-going employees are really tired. They've often been working 12-hour shifts and they want to get home. And the incoming employees are often angry or upset because they're coming into a work environment where something's gone wrong, some tasks haven't been completed, they're having to pick up for somebody else who they might not see as carrying their weight, or whatever. And so there are lots of ways that the shift change routine becomes a space where people don't relate to each other with compassion around the work. And so we've been in conversation with people who wanted to try this, inviting them to reimagine the shift change and how they would do the shift change if they were going to be more compassionate to themselves, more compassionate to their colleague, and then more compassionate to the third-party stakeholder, whether that's a patient in a healthcare environment or the next group that receives their work, if it's a manufacturing environment where they're passing something off, or the customer. And by just having a quick, pretty simple conversation about reimagining the shift change and then inviting people to experiment with it and debrief over a couple of weeks, we've seen a pretty tremendous change, both in people's behavior in how they do the shift change routine, but also in how they feel about their broader work environment and their colleagues. So in one instance, after 6 months after the intervention in the shift change and the reimagining the shift change with compassion, we see people having a stronger sense of satisfaction with their work, and also their stakeholder is more satisfied with the work that they're getting from them. So I think routines are a really underutilized space where you can reimagine organizations as much more systemic spaces for compassion. And in our book, we end the book with what we call blueprints to help you use this social architecture and apply it in your work environment. So the blueprints are all basically questions that help you figure out how to relate these concepts to your own work. I'll just leave this blueprint up here and invite you again to ask any questions that you have of this framework. And Olivia, if you want to come back on, I don't know if there are other questions in the Q&A panel yet.
Thank you, Monica. That was just awesome. Yes, we've got a couple more questions. There's one from Catherine, and she's wondering, is there any risk of codifying pain if we focus on noticing rather than on right action?
Oh, thank you, Catherine. That's a really interesting question. I do think if you take noticing without embedding it in the rest of the process, and you think that noticing in and of itself is going to be compassionate, then I do think there is a risk that you're simply going to reify pain, or that in fact in work organizations sometimes insensitive noticing of pain actually creates more pain instead of creating compassion. So I really hear the complexity within your question, and I do think that if you think of this as a process where noticing leads into interpreting, feeling, and acting, and right action, actually how we know what right action is partially a function of good noticing. That would be how I would sort of think conceptually about managing the risk. I actually have a story about this that I just heard from another compassion researcher that I think is helpful. This was in a university environment, and this researcher, apparently one of the custodians in their university environment had been diagnosed with cancer and was going to have to take a significant leave of absence to get some pretty substantial cancer treatment. And the administration had decided that they really wanted to do something. So they knew about the cancer diagnosis and the request for a leave of absence because, of course, of the human resource process. But they didn't do noticing in a sensitive and appropriate way. So Catherine's kind of pointing toward the problematics of noticing arose here, where the organization sent out a message broadly to faculty and staff about this cancer diagnosis and about announcing a party to raise money and to say goodbye to this custodian. But they didn't ask for permission in advance to send that message, and they didn't let the person know that they were going to be broadcasting this diagnosis broadly through the organization. So this insensitive noticing led to an action that actually created a lot of pain, and the custodian felt taken aback. Of course, the party was perceived as somewhat inappropriate and awkward because it wasn't, that person didn't really view it as a time in their life of celebration. And while the custodian ended up being very grateful for the emotional support and the financial help that was generated, the process by which it was organized was actually painful to the custodian and also painful to the rest of the staff who felt awkward and they didn't know how to handle the fact that something had been revealed that wasn't necessarily theirs to know. And so I think that everywhere along, every step of the process, noticing and inquiring more, interpreting differently and interpreting with more generosity, feeling more empathic concern and teaching ourselves how to feel more and more and more empathic concern, even when we're tempted to close ourselves off to all the suffering around us, and then how to turn that into customized action that makes sense and will actually alleviate suffering. It's such a complex process, and each part of it is colored by the organization around it. So that's a long answer, Catherine, but it's a place of deep passion for me. I think one of the things we have to combat as change agents when we want to talk about compassion in workplaces is people have a very simplistic sense that compassion is nice, and if people are more quote unquote nice to each other, everything will be more compassionate. But in fact, as you all know, as change agents and as practitioners of compassion, it's quite complex, and human suffering draws us into the need for deep sensitivity, for listening, and for interpersonal and emotional skill that many of us just aren't necessarily equipped for, and that organizations can actually make harder rather than easier.
I would totally agree with that organizations aren't always equipped, or the individual isn't. And it can be sometimes a really quick fix to take the easy route instead of the more difficult route, which is the compassion one. I remember as a young HR professional being told that I would never be successful in human resources if I continued to wear my heart on my sleeve.
Yes.
And in hindsight, I think that was somebody who just didn't know how to have those more difficult conversations.
And
take the right action.
Think of that as role socialization, right? If you think in the social architecture terms that I was presenting, what part of how we know what our job is and what we're responsible for is how people more senior or with more experience or tenure in the organization give us messages about what's appropriate and inappropriate for us to take responsibility for. And when you have that kind of role socialization where people are saying, oh, don't wear your heart on your sleeve, don't you dare care about other people, don't be emotional, right? Like all those kinds of role messages can really squash compassion. I heard a nurse actually give an example of that in the conference I was just at as well, where she, in her very first day out of nursing school, reporting for her very first shift ever, she was so excited and proud to be a nurse, and the first nurse she interacted with said, "You smile a lot. This system is going to drill that out of you really quick." And that was her role introduction to what it meant to be a nurse. Right? Don't smile so much. Don't make it so obvious there.
I remember meeting a young neonatal nurse who was told all through school that she was too compassionate. And then she gets into the workplace and she again was told she was too compassionate. And so she started to live into that new role and that new expectation that people had of her.
Yeah.
As you put in your book, hearts to stone, I think that's just such a great definition of our hearts turning to stone.
Yes.
And that goes along with a great question that Susan has. Are you aware of any corporations that employ a compassion position that specifically would pay attention to employees, build resistance ahead of time, and develop support teams? And I know you have lots of great examples in your book. Is there one that really stands out for you?
Yeah, there are a couple that stand out to me that are different forms of a compassion position. So in our book, one of the things we do when we try to convey a story that really brings to life what we mean by a highly competent system. Like, what would it mean if a system was highly competent? And we tell a story of one of the most highly competent systems we ever studied. And the story involves one employee who's a relatively low-level employee in a remote subsidiary location who's injured in a bicycle accident that's off of work time, and how that injury and the resulting treatment that was necessary became a focus of the entire global organization. And the person was supported by their work organization and their team for months and months and months and months of rehabilitation, going all the way from his direct line manager to the global head of HR and the CEO. And one of the things that happened within that system that enabled competence, and we look at all the dimensions of the social architecture and how they're contributing to that system, because while we tell that one story to make it vivid, what we know about the competence was that stories like that were happening all the time, all around the world, and the organization was responding to all of them. We found very few instances where there was some form of suffering that the organization wasn't tending to. So the competence was in its capacity to do this compassion work across a global system in relation to many different episodes of suffering. And the leader of the organization had given a mandate to the head of human resources in this case, and said, basically, within 48 hours, if anything substantial happens to an employee in our organization, I want to know about it. So the global head of human resources actually transformed over time her position to what she called Chief Compassion Officer. And she's not the only leader that I know of who has over time evolved a leadership position that was focused in some kind of way on humans into being a Chief Compassion Officer. So I am aware of corporations that have that either within their human resource function or as a separate part of what they do, where they name it as a compassion officer. I've heard a really wonderful example from the Costco organization, which is a retail organization that is a different kind of compassion position. So one thing they learned about their workforce is that because they make an effort to pay very good wages given retail work, and because their workforce is relatively young, they were coping with a lot of substance abuse among their employees, and they were looking for a creative solution to help employees address substance abuse that was becoming problematic at work. And one of the ways that they did it that I think was very creative and interesting is they took their EAP program, their Employee Assistance Program, which is sometimes an outsourced source of help that people can call outside of the organization. And they said, you know, let's reimagine this as internal social work. And they actually called them at first social workers, and then they renamed them. But they took people under the auspices of their employee assistance program and made them embedded, basically, caregivers within every retail team. So every retail team had a social worker embedded, basically. And the job of that person was not to be punitive, but to actually keep an eye on what was happening, to watch for the indicators of substance use that might be becoming a performance problem, and to help intervene early so that people could stay out of trouble, both in their lives with substance use, but also in their work before they got into performance issues that might result in termination. So that's not a, you know, that's a very different than a CEO or Chief Compassion Officer position, but I think it's another example of a compassion dedicated position in a kind of work where you might not necessarily expect it. The other one that's interesting that I want to mention is that many organizations now have ombuds persons. This is very typical in universities, but lots of corporations are adopting this model as well. And it's a space where you can turn it into a compassion position, because an ombuds person is a dedicated role for alternative dispute resolution. And that role done with compassion, where you think of your job as helping people understand how to resolve conflicts in ways that build more compassion into the system, and that build people's capacity to resolve conflicts differently and to decrease incivility in the work environment, is another really interesting role that's actually, I think, a paid compassion position.
I could see that we could probably continue this conversation for at least another hour. Monica, it's just been so enlightening, and I know we are rounding the corner to our 90 minutes here, and I'm coming back to a quote that I read in your book to kind of sum it up around compassion is not just a nice to have, it is the hidden heart of strategic success. And I think that you've certainly given us some amazing tools around those strategies, which are so important in organizations, of how do you not go out and create a new strategy, but how do you embed into the ones that are already there? And that really is the blueprint that you've highlighted for us, is how do we continue to embed into what is already there and make it even more stronger and more compassionate. I love that term around the quiet power, because that's really what this is. In closing off and thanking Monica, please, if this was of value to you, if you want to continue to join us for webinars and for lots of the different events that we have through the Charter, please know that the work that we do is volunteer work. We don't have any big funders. We have lots of people who want to make a difference on the planet, who make contributions. If this was of value to you and you want to make a donation, $5 to $25 to whatever feels right for you, we would very much appreciate that. Just on a quick note before we close, the Charter for Compassion, also if you go onto the homepage, there are two places you may want to look at. One is the marketplace, and I know that Monica and Jane's book, Awakening Compassion at Work, is for sale on the marketplace, and you can get lots of wonderful products and services there to support your work in compassion, as well as you may want to look at the Compassion Charter Education Institute. What you see on the screen right now are 5 courses that are coming up, and they're run all the time on an online platform. Some you can take whenever it works for you, and other ones will be very specific dates that they begin. Monica and I have been in conversation around the fact that her and Jane want to actually put this onto an online program of some type, and with more information so that you can kind of deep dive it a little bit more. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned for when that will come up. We advertise them way in advance so that you know kind of approximately what semester they'll be coming on, and you can find us on the homepage of the Charter website as well. So in closing off, Monica, a big thank you to you for just an amazing presentation and lots of great takeaways for everyone.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who attended. And I would love to be in contact with anyone who has more questions. And thank you to the Charter for your continued work. We're proud and happy to support it in any way we can.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Have a wonderful day.